Fayetteville, North Carolina, in the spring of 1985, represented a community where families routinely left doors unlocked, children played freely in front yards, and neighbors instinctively watched out for one another. This sense of security was shattered by the events that unfolded in the home of Captain Gary Eastburn, his wife Katie, and their young daughters. The family included 5-year-old Cara, 3-year-old Aaron, and 22-month-old Jana. On May 7, 1985, Gary Eastburn, an Air Force captain, kissed his family goodbye and boarded a plane destined for England. He was heading overseas for a temporary training assignment with the Air Force, leaving Katie alone to care for the 3 little girls. This departure was not unusual for his career, but this time, fate had an unspeakable tragedy waiting for the Eastburns. The family was planning a permanent relocation to England, where Gary was scheduled to take up a liaison job with the Royal Air Force. In preparation for this move, Katie made arrangements to rehouse the family's dog, Dixie, by placing an advertisement in the local newspaper. This effort to find a new home for the dog set the stage for a seemingly ordinary, brief interaction that would tragically introduce the family to their eventual perpetrator. The catalyst for the horrific events began immediately following Katie Eastburn's newspaper advertisement seeking a new home for the family dog, Dixie. Within days of the ad's placement, a man arrived at the Eastburn residence. He was identified as Timothy Hennis, a 27-year-old Army sergeant stationed at the nearby military installation, Fort Bragg. Hennis came to the door for the purpose of adopting the dog. Their exchange was characterized as brief, seemingly ordinary, and entirely transactional on the surface. Neither Katie nor her 3 young daughters could have possibly known that this casual interaction was, in fact, the sinister beginning of their end. This single meeting was pivotal. Timothy Hennis was established as the last individual known to have interacted with Katie Eastburn just before the discovery of the brutal crime. Consequently, this crucial initial encounter immediately positioned Hennis as a central and critical point of focus for the law enforcement investigators commencing their desperate search for the person responsible for the unimaginable tragedy. The mounting concern among the neighbors began to escalate as early as May 10th. By that day, newspapers had noticeably started to pile up at the end of the Eastburn driveway, causing a knot of apprehension in neighbor Catherine Strickland's stomach. The following day, May 11th, an unsettling silence prevailed in the home. No one had seen Katie. The girls were not playing outside, and the blinds remained stubbornly drawn. Katie also failed to answer her husband Gary's routine phone call from England. By May 12th, the neighbors could no longer ignore these alarming signs and contacted the police to request a formal welfare check. The moment officers stepped inside the Eastburn home, the immediate and unmistakable stench confirmed their worst fears. Upstairs, in the master bedroom, they found Katie Eastburn. She was unclothed from the waist down, brutally and indecently assaulted, and horrifically stabbed a total of 15 times. Just down the hallway, 5-year-old Cara was discovered, having been stabbed repeatedly in the chest. 3-year-old Aaron had been bludgeoned in the chest and back, also fatally stabbed repeatedly as both girls slept, and tragically, their throats had been slashed. In the midst of the carnage, investigators made an incredible discovery. 22-month-old Jana was still alive in her crib. She was weak and clearly clinging to life, having been left without food or water for days, somehow surviving the atrocity that had claimed her mother and sisters. The severity of the scene shocked, even hardened investigators, who immediately labeled the event not merely a slaying, but a massacre. The police's immediate forensic response involved meticulously combing the house, leading to the recovery of fingerprints and hair. A luminol test conducted on the walls and in the master bathroom indicated that the perpetrator had attempted an unsuccessful cleanup of the crime scene. Once back in Fayetteville, Gary Eastburn assisted detectives in identifying several missing items, which included an envelope containing cash, Katie's ATM card, and a crucial piece of paper on which her ATM password had been written. Based on their initial findings, the investigators estimated that the crime occurred during a narrow window, specifically between 8 p.m. on May 9th and 3 a.m. on May 10th. Desperate to secure a lead, detectives turned to the only survivor, the 22-month-old infant Jana, to see if she could offer any clues. They enlisted child psychologist Helen Brantley to question Jana, showing her pictures of her family and various police photo lineups. Brantley's summary report indicated she was uncertain if Jana had actually seen the events that night, but the child had clearly heard things. Ultimately, the information gathered could not conclusively assist the active investigation. However, in the days immediately following the crime, the police found someone who could provide crucial details. A young man came forward as an eyewitness, reporting that he saw a tall white male leaving the Eastburn home near Fort Bragg at approximately 3:30 that morning, May 10th. The suspect was dressed in jeans, a knit cap, and a black members-only jacket, seen exiting the driveway, carrying a garbage bag. The man then drove away in a white Chevrolet Chevette. Investigators also located a bloody sneaker print at the crime scene, and the witness's testimony helped police to create a composite sketch of the suspect. The investigation's focus immediately narrowed in on Timothy Hennis following the crucial dog adoption tip provided by Katie Eastburn's arrangements. This swift progress led directly to Hennis's arrest on May 15th, a mere 3 days after the tragic discovery of the bodies. He was formally charged with indecent assault and 3 counts of slaying. The initial trial concluded in 1986 when a jury convicted Hennis, leading to his sentence of the end of life penalty. However, this conviction was not the final word. In 1988, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned the verdict, citing that the jury had been unfairly swayed and prejudiced by the intensely graphic nature of the crime scene photographs presented during the proceedings. Hennis faced a second trial in 1989, which resulted in his acquittal. Timothy Hennis walked free, subsequently rejoined the United States Army, where he served honorably for many years, eventually retiring as a Master Sergeant in 2004. The case against him was closed, leaving the brutal Eastburn family massacre officially unresolved for a decade and a half. By the early 2000s, the rapid advancements in forensic science provided a path to reopen the cold case that had remained unsolved for years. In 2006, investigators successfully retested preserved male DNA evidence that had been recovered from the original crime scene. The results of this modern analysis were unequivocal and chilling. The DNA conclusively matched Timothy Hennis. Although the Fifth Amendment's double jeopardy clause prohibits retrials following an acquittal, a unique legal avenue was available. This was due to the United States Constitution's dual sovereignty doctrine, which permits a defendant previously acquitted in a state court, as Hennis was in 1989, to face retrial in a federal court. Furthermore, the Uniform Code of Military Justice specifically allows military personnel tried in a civilian court to be court-martialed. Acting upon the request of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant General John R. Vines, the commanding officer at Fort Bragg, strategically agreed to recall the retired Hennis back into active service. This action served as the necessary pretext to formally charge him based on the irrefutable new DNA evidence. Timothy Hennis was officially recalled to military duty on September 26, 2006, initiating a complex final legal chapter. Hennis spent years engaging in legal battles, repeatedly appealing the order for a court-martial from December 2007 through December 2009, though all his petitions were systematically denied. The military trial finally commenced at Fort Bragg on March 17, 2010, and spanned 3 weeks. The prosecution, spearheaded by Army Captains Matt Scott and Nathan Huff, anchored its case on the new DNA evidence, which was powerfully corroborated by the prior eyewitness accounts. Conversely, Hennis's defense team, led by military lawyer Frank Spinner, mounted a challenge by arguing that the crime scene evidence had been contaminated. Spinner also introduced the theory that Hennis had engaged in consensual intercourse with Katie before her end, an assertion that Hennis himself denied. Following an intense period of only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury panel, composed of 14 military officers and non-commissioned personnel, reached a unanimous decision, finding Timothy Hennis guilty. The protracted pursuit of justice for the Eastburn family massacre, lasting 25 years, finally reached its conclusion. On April 3, 2010, the court-martial jury convicted Timothy Hennis, marking the second time he had been found guilty of the slayings. Just 5 days later, on April 8, 2010, Hennis was sentenced for the 3rd time to the ultimate punishment, the end of life penalty. He currently remains incarcerated on Capital Punishment Row at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The narrative of the Eastburn case cannot conclude without acknowledging the only survivor, baby Jana. She grew up with a profound and inescapable knowledge that she had been spared from the horrific fate that brutally took her mother and 2 sisters. Her survival serves as a lasting symbol of the enduring cost of the crime and the long, arduous journey endured by the victim's family. This final verdict ultimately offered a measure of closure after 2 decades of legal battles and uncertainty, ensuring that the perpetrator of the massacre was finally held accountable under the law. On February 10, 1993, in Indianapolis, Indiana, Richard Hoagland placed a hurried and vague phone call to his wife, Linda. He claimed he was unwell and told her he was going to the emergency room. Linda offered to accompany him, but Richard quickly declined, stating he did not have the time to wait for her. Linda waited for hours that day, but Richard never came home. When she called local hospitals, none had a record of him checking in. The initial confusion for investigators was profound. Richard's car was missing, yet he left behind no note. His toothbrush was still there, and he had not packed any clothes. Critically, despite the cold February weather, he had not taken his coat. He did not even take his passport, a major oversight if traveling was the intention. Richard, a husband and father of 2 boys, was simply gone. The investigation quickly shifted focus to Richard Hoagland's established life. Linda described her husband as a very successful man, noting he was very spontaneous, a shaker and a roller, always making deals and doing things. He left behind a seemingly perfect life. Linda, their son Matthew, who was 9, and his brother Doug, age 6, enjoying a big house, a steady income, and exotic family vacations. Police were brought in, and initially, foul play was suspected. However, as investigators began digging deeper, the narrative changed dramatically. They discovered evidence suggesting something far stranger than a random crime. Richard had emptied joint bank accounts and taken important documents. These clues indicated that Richard did not simply vanish, but rather planned his own departure. His unexplained exit left Linda struggling desperately to pay the mounting bills while trying to raise their children alone. Eventually, authorities located Richard's car, abandoned at the Indianapolis International Airport. This discovery provided a potential clue, yet investigators confirmed there was no record of Richard Hoagland taking any flights out of the airport on the day he vanished, deepening the mystery. The months following his disappearance were silent until that summer. His 2 sons, Matthew and Doug, each received a birthday card from their father. Each card contained $50. The note inside Doug's card contained the last words the children would ever hear from Richard. The message read, "Maybe sometime soon we will get to see each other. I bet I will not even know you. It has been so long. Mind your mother. Bye, Dad." The financial consequences of Richard's vanishing act were immediate and severe for the Hoagland family. Linda lost the house and the cars after his sudden departure, forcing her to rely heavily on her mother, who stepped in to offer essential support. As the months stretched into difficult years, the painful truth became increasingly undeniable to authorities and the family. Richard was not taken, but rather he deliberately chose to disappear from his life. After an entire decade passed without any contact, Richard Hoagland was legally declared deceased. Linda was eventually able to find closure and move forward with her life, eventually remarrying, after years of living without concrete answers regarding the man who had been her husband. While no one in Indiana knew his whereabouts, Richard Hoagland had traveled to Florida, where he carried out an elaborate act of identity theft. He began a second life by assuming the name of Terry Szymanski, a fisherman who had tragically passed away back in 1991 at the age of 33. Richard managed to find Terry's birth certificate by digging through available public records, using this single document as the foundation to rebuild his existence. Now, living as Terry, Richard successfully married again and even had another child, establishing a completely new family. He also bought property and held various jobs, living openly for more than 2 decades, completely hidden in plain sight, with his deception remaining intact. The meticulously crafted deception that Richard Hoagland maintained for over 20 years finally began to crumble in 2016. The catalyst for the truth emerging was a curious family member, Terry Szymanski's real nephew. While building a comprehensive family tree online, the nephew stumbled across highly unusual and bizarre records. These records indicated that Terry Szymanski, who was confirmed to have passed away in 1991, had inexplicably remarried years later. Alarmed by this clear impossibility, the nephew immediately contacted the authorities to report the strange discovery. This critical tip triggered an official investigation into the identity records. That thorough investigation conclusively revealed the shocking truth. The man in Florida living under the stolen name of Terry Szymanski was, in fact, the long-missing Richard Hoagland. The lengthy investigation concluded leading directly to Richard Hoagland's arrest in Florida. He was officially charged with the crime of identity theft for assuming the life of Terry Szymanski. Following his apprehension, Richard was finally forced to face the reality and consequences of a life he had chosen to abandon decades earlier, confronting the family he left behind. Richard Hoagland subsequently pleaded guilty to the charges brought against him by federal authorities. He was sentenced to a term of 2 years in federal prison for the crime. For Linda and her sons, the startling news of his survival and arrest brought forth a complex, difficult, and overwhelming blend of emotions. The truth generated not just relief at knowing, but deep anger and profound sadness. The resolution of the criminal case provided a difficult form of emotional and legal closure for Linda and her sons. For nearly 25 years, the family had lived with the agonizing uncertainty of wondering what terrible fate had befallen their loved one. The ultimate answers were devastating. They discovered that Richard had not been the victim of foul play, but instead had simply walked away from them. He chose to rebuild his entire life and start a completely new family while intentionally leaving his first family to cope with the ruin he had created. On May 14, 2018, the legal proceedings concluded with a judge ordering Richard Hoagland to pay the significant sum of $1.86 million in back child support. In May 1996, Virginia Beach police responded to a shocking scene inside a quiet residence. The victim, 27-year-old Navy air traffic controller Elise Makdessi, was found tied to her bed, her throat cut, and stabbed multiple times. The body of a fellow Navy sailor, Quincy Brown, lay nearby. He had been fatally shot. Detectives struggled initially to comprehend the horrifying dual crime and the connection between the two slain Navy personnel. As the investigation progressed, the team began to uncover a complex, tangled tale centered on deceit, financial motives, and ultimate betrayal that shocked the entire community. Just days before the violent attacks, Elise recorded a videotape. On it, she accused fellow sailors, specifically Quincy Brown, of indecently assaulting and harassing her. Her husband, Adib Eddie Makdessi, appeared on the tape, visibly supporting these serious claims against the Navy personnel. This recording would soon become a central piece of the puzzle. Investigators quickly believed the videotape was just part of a calculated, larger scheme. Prosecutors argued Eddie and Elise staged the accusation to strengthen a potential lawsuit against the Navy. Their true motivation was to secure life insurance money from the eventual planned deaths. Prosecutors painstakingly outlined the events of May 14, 1996. Quincy Brown was invited to the Makdessi home, unaware he was walking into a deadly, meticulously planned trap. This ambush had been carefully set by the Makdessis for calculated financial gain. According to the theory presented by the prosecution, Eddie Makdessi fatally shot Quincy Brown immediately upon his arrival at the home. Subsequently, to eliminate all potential loose ends or witnesses, Eddie allegedly turned on Elise, subjecting her to a brutal attack that tragically ended her life as well. Eddie Makdessi claimed self-defense, asserting Quincy attacked Elise and he simply intervened. However, the physical evidence available severely contradicted his version of events. The binding of Elise and the forensic analysis of blood patterns proved otherwise, undermining Eddie's self-defense narrative. Following the horrific crime, Eddie Makdessi immediately fled the country, leaving the United States. Despite the determined efforts of Virginia Beach detectives, they could not locate him. The Makdessi case officially went cold, remaining unsolved for a full decade while Eddie was a fugitive overseas. A full decade after the tragic slayings, Eddie Makdessi finally resurfaced in Russia, where he was trying to start a new life. Authorities subsequently caught him, and he was quickly extradited back to Virginia to face justice. In 2006, Eddie stood before a jury as prosecutors presented their case. The prosecution meticulously detailed how Eddie plotted the attacks for financial gain, using Elise's false accusations as the central setup. The jury ultimately found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree slaying. Eddie was sentenced to life in prison and ordered to pay over $200,000 in fines. Regina Harrison was born on April 30, 1963. She spent her formative years growing up in Florida, amidst the sunshine and community of South Florida. By 1983, at just 20 years old, Regina was still residing with her parents while pursuing her education at Palm Beach Atlanta Junior College. She was known to her family and peers as a young woman of deep faith. She was kind, thoughtful, friendly, and notably trusting, often carrying religious pamphlets in her bag. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1983, Regina departed from her family's home for a routine bicycle ride. Her destination was the Hollywood Broadwalk, a popular stretch by the beach. This simple, innocent outing marked the last instance her family ever saw her alive. Crucially, witnesses later recounted seeing Regina riding alongside a specific individual, a skinny, long-haired man who was also riding a black bicycle. At the time, no one realized how vital this single detail would become. The search for the missing 20-year-old Regina Harrison ended tragically the very next day. On May 3rd, 1983, her body was discovered within the boundaries of West Lake Park in Hollywood, Florida. The medical examination confirmed the horrific nature of the crime. Regina had been indecently assaulted and subsequently strangled. Near the discovery site, detectives meticulously documented the presence of her personal belongings. Her bicycle, her neatly folded clothes, her backpack, and the religious pamphlets she always carried. The shocking and brutal nature of the crime sent immediate ripples of fear through the Hollywood community, utterly devastating her family. The immediate focus of the investigation was centered on identifying and locating the unknown man last seen riding with her. By the summer of 1983, a composite sketch based on eyewitness accounts was actively circulated to the public. Witnesses soon began pointing law enforcement toward a man named Ronald Henry Stewart, who was already identified in police records as a known serial predator. By March 1984, less than a year after the crime, a grand jury officially indicted Ronald Henry Stewart for Regina Harrison's demise. Stewart immediately insisted that he was innocent of the specific crime, yet his established and documented criminal history ultimately worked strongly against him in the legal process. Facing the extreme possibility of the end-of-life penalty, Stewart ultimately chose to accept a negotiated plea deal presented by the prosecution. On January 28, 1985, Stewart formally entered a no-contest plea to a charge of second-degree slaying in Regina's case. This plea resulted in him receiving a substantial sentence of 50 years in prison. Crucially, this sentence was structured to run concurrently with other sentences he was already serving for his multiple indecent assaults. For the established legal justice system, the case was now formally concluded. Despite the official closure, however, unresolved questions continued to linger and trouble Regina's family. For more than 2 decades, Stewart served time, consistently upholding his claim of innocence regarding Regina's case. Ronald Henry Stewart died in prison due to cancer in 2008, having maintained his innocence in Regina Harrison's case until his last breath. Coincidentally, around this time, significant new forensic methods, particularly DNA profiling, were fundamentally transforming how cold cases were scrutinized and potentially solved, making Stewart's decades-old conviction look increasingly fragile. The actual truth regarding the 1983 slaying emerged from a completely unexpected source. This source was Jack Harold Jones, a convicted perpetrator and predator serving time on death row in Arkansas. Jones was awaiting execution for the 1995 indecent assault and subsequent death of Mary Phillips. Before his own execution in 2017, Jones wrote a detailed letter to his sister, confessing directly to the crime committed against Regina Harrison back in 1983. He strategically instructed her not to deliver the crucial letter until a full year after his passing. When this delayed letter was finally handed over to Florida detectives in 2018, investigators immediately took the necessary action to reopen Regina's case for review. Following the case being reopened, investigators quickly moved to test preserved evidence from the 1983 crime scene, utilizing powerful modern DNA methods. The conclusive results were absolutely undeniable. The recovered DNA profile matched Jack Harold Jones precisely and decisively excluded Ronald Stewart. In 2019, an astonishing more than 35 years after Regina's tragic demise, the Broward County prosecutors officially and formally exonerated Stewart. They publicly acknowledged that his conviction had been regrettably wrongful, founded upon demonstrably flawed eyewitness identification and reliance on purely circumstantial evidence. Stewart's name was finally and completely cleared, though sadly, this vital justice was delivered posthumously. Regina's family faced complex mixed emotions. There was profound relief that the difficult truth about Jones, the actual perpetrator, had at last surfaced, yet deep sorrow remained that decades were consumed by a wrongful conviction, and the man responsible for Regina's brutal slaying had already been executed for a separate, heinous crime.